Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the BICOM podcast. I'm Ronie Gazit from the BICOM team, and I'm delighted to be joined by Ghaith al-Omari, who is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's Irwin Levy Family Program on the U.S.-Israel Strategic Relationship. And previously, he served as an advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during the 1999 to 2001 permanent status talks, in addition to holding various other positions within the Palestinian Authority. So, Ray, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Ronie. It's a pleasure.
So perhaps we will start with the most obvious, which is that we are talking today on July 1st, which many have termed Annexation Day, and is the earliest date that Israel could make a decision on annexing parts of the West Bank. But it looks like this day is coming and going without much occasion. We see that in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition partner, Benny Gantz, has opposed annexation. And we also see that there's still ongoing talks between the Israeli government, specifically Benjamin Netanyahu, and the U.S. administration about the extent of annexation, what it will look like, and no decision has been reached. But what is missing from these discussions and these talks is the Palestinian Authority. So perhaps, Ray, given your experience, you can talk to us a little bit about what the position of the Palestinian Authority has been towards annexation, as much of an obvious question as that may be.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Palestinian Authority is fundamentally opposed to annexation. It's opposed to annexation both, as a political matter, but also it goes deeper than that. I mean, the Palestinian Authority was founded for one reason: to be a transitional authority in charge of leading the Palestinian people through negotiations, through diplomacy, to achieving independence and statehood. And annexation undermines this very fundamental message and mission of the Palestinian Authority. So for the PA, this has been seen as a fundamental, as an existential threat to its very foundations. By the way, this is something that Hamas picked up on, and Hamas has been for the last 3 weeks consistently messaging that annexation shows that the PA and the Oslo process and diplomacy are useless. So the PA is using basically a three-pronged approach. It uses a diplomatic approach, working with the Arabs, with the Europeans, with the UN, to try to create an international front against annexation. It is, secondly, trying to mobilize its public, and so far with very, very limited success. And finally, by severing relations with Israel, both security and civilian, it's trying to confront Israel with a glimpse of what things would look like if annexation were to happen. No security cooperation, potential for a PA collapse, and all of these things. So this is the PA's approach. But so far, it's been an approach with limited success because the PA's ability to implement this strategy has its own built-in limitations.
So talking about this, the security coordination between Israel and the Palestinians, many people in Israel talk about how essential that is for the stability and security of the West Bank for everyone that lives there. And despite, the PA saying that they halted coordination last month, there are rumors that this is still going on and that there's local cooperation. So how damaging do you think this decision to stop the coordination really is? And do you think that there's a way back to resume this type of coordination at a higher level?
Let me start from the end. Resuming cooperation would be extremely easy. I mean, every Palestinian security official, high security official, has on speed dial the numbers of their Israeli counterparts and vice versa. And as you mentioned, there continues to be informal contacts. And I would add to this as well that there continues to be coordination today through third parties, whether it is the U.S. security coordinator, a 3-star general who is on the ground there, through the ICRC, the International Red Cross Committee, and many other channels. So restarting it would not be difficult. And also one of the reasons that we have not really felt the impact of this severing of security cooperation is the fact that the PA said from the outset that they will continue fighting terror. So even if there is no cooperation, the PA continues to fulfill many of the functions, thwarting Hamas infrastructure, returning Israelis who stray into Palestinian areas. So the PA is unilaterally doing what it has been doing for a long time. All of that said, there continues to be a lot of concern because with the passage of time, many of these practices might fray, many of these relationships might cool down, and this kind of autopilot approach works when there is no major crisis. And so far, luckily, we have seen no major crisis. Security cooperation of the kind that we were used to in the past is most effective when you have a crisis, whether it is a terror attack, whether it's an escalation, whether it is any of things of these sorts. This is, I think, if God forbid we get to one of these moments, this is when we will feel that the cost. And I can tell you that Israeli security officials, those that I've spoken to recently, are very worried about this particular scenario.
So looking at these crises, these moments where security cooperation and coordination is really useful, there is a lot of concern that any Israeli move to annex parts of the West Bank may lead to violence. And people warned of this when the U.S. moved its embassy to Jerusalem, but we didn't see much come out of that. So how different do you see this Israeli move to annex parts of the West Bank, and how concerned would you be over potential violence?
It's very different on at least two levels. One is the move of the embassy to Jerusalem was not an Israeli act. Right. It was an American act. And as such, while people were unhappy about it, no one really, the Palestinians did not direct their anger at Israel. The action they took was vis-a-vis the United States. This is an purely Israeli act. And also, frankly, the impact of annexation. And here, again, it's a difficult statement to make because we actually don't know what annexation would look like. Big, small, large, limited, etc. This would, if the annexation takes place in its most expansive way, this could kill the two-state solution. Make it completely unpractical on logistical grounds. And so the reaction will be very different. Now, will it lead to violence? We absolutely have no idea. If you look at opinion polls, and you have to take opinion polls with a grain of salt, but if you look at opinion polls, they say that the Palestinian public, on the one hand, is extremely opposed to annexation. On the other hand, it really has no appetite for more violence. People are still scarred from the results of the second intifada, understand that violence ultimately does not work to the Palestinian interest. Yes, there is a lot of anger. We don't know, though, if it will translate to violence. That said, as history has shown us, even if the public does not have a great appetite for violence, things can take a life of their own. All of it takes is a number of confrontations leading to high casualties for a couple of days. You end up with a cycle of revenge, and often a public that is checked out, which is really how I would describe the Palestinian public today. This apathy could very quickly turn into anger. And if you have a Palestinian Authority, as we have today, that does not have the moral authority to rein its people in, and the security forces that are not getting paid, that are in a mindset as they are today, then the possibility of things spinning out of control is real. Though, again, I would not be alarmist, and I would say today polls show us that the public does not want violence. But again, as I said, this could change very quickly.
Circling back to comments you made a little earlier about Hamas and their approach or reaction to annexation, we saw last week that Qatar said that they would halt aid to Gaza should Israel decide to annex parts of the West Bank. And this Qatari aid has been critical to much of the stability or, keeping any type of outburst from happening in the Gaza Strip. So how concerned would you be if that aid stops coming in, and what steps the international community might be able to take to help the Gazans?
First of all, I find it very problematic when the Qataris come and say, to confront annexation, we're going to punish the Palestinians. There's something wrong in that statement. That said, I am not, frankly, too worried. The Qataris have said things like this before, and they continued paying. For Qatar, aid to Gaza helps them in two ways. It helps them in showing, their constituency, which is very much a Muslim Brotherhood constituency, that they continue to support, quote unquote, the cause of the Muslim Brotherhood. Remember, Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood organization. And frankly, for the Qataris, the aid to Gaza has been a roundabout way of establishing relations with Israel. The Qatari envoy spends more time in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv than he does in Gaza. So I'm not worried yet. I would say that if the Qatari aid were to stop for whatever reason, then that is a major cause of concern. It's a major cause of concern on many levels. On a humanitarian level, it's huge. Gaza has been teetering on the edge, and this has been one of the things that has been keeping Gaza afloat. It's also very concerning from a security point of view. In many ways, what we saw over the last maybe year and a half, is a tacit understanding by which the Gaza Hamas leadership, particularly their Gaza chief, a guy called Yahya Sinwar, they have basically reached an understanding that as long as the economic situation continues to be stable, whether through Qatari aid, whether through Israel relaxing some of the strictures on movement of goods in and out of Gaza, the Hamas will curb the violence. And if we end up with a situation where the economy starts spinning out of control, then Hamas will be under pressure and will have the motivation to actually go back not only to the kind of border skirmishes that we saw in previous months, but maybe even to something more escalated. So, but the international community, there's not really much more that can be done. Many European countries do not want to do what the Qataris are doing because much of the Qatari money goes to Hamas, and no European country that I know would be willing to fund Hamas. And frankly, the amount of money that is in question is one that, again, no other donor country besides the Qataris, I believe right now, given COVID and all of the other priorities, can pump into Gaza. So the Qatari aid is key, and and if it were to end, then I worry that we will see a very fast deterioration in Gaza and a very violent deterioration in Gaza.
So turning our attention a little bit east now, you've spoken about Jordan and their reaction to Israeli annexation. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the response has been so far and what has been indicated in terms of what Jordan might do should Israel annex parts of the West Bank, and what impact that may have on its peace treaty with Israel?
Of course. I mean, for Jordan, first of all, I mean, annexation would threaten some of Jordan's national security, core national security interests. And I think this is an important point to make, because I've been hearing especially from the Israeli kind of right-leaning voices, that Jordan will do absolutely nothing. No, for Jordan, if this happens, it will be forced to act because it feels that some of its core national security interests will be threatened. And already Jordan has made it very, very clear to Israel and to the international community that Jordan will act in a very robust way. Just, I think this week or last week, the chief of Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, was in Jordan, met with the king, and the message he received was extremely clear. There will be a high price to pay. Now, that said, Jordan also understands that it has strategic interest in its relations with Israel, primarily security, but also water and energy, which Jordan gets from Israel according to the peace treaty and according to later agreements that were signed. And Jordan will not jeopardize this. So Jordan will play from within this kind of this margin of maneuver, but it has a lot that it can do. At a minimum, Jordan will, if there's annexation, will withdraw its ambassador and expel the Israeli ambassador. Jordan will also lead, and it has already started leading, the international effort against annexation. I mean, I mentioned earlier that the Palestinians' ability to conduct their diplomacy is limited. Their skills and capacity is not particularly impressive. The Jordanians are actually extremely capable. We've seen them mobilize some of the Arab actors. The king has been in touch with the Emirati the Emirati crown prince, who's the actual leader of the Emirates, with the Saudis, Qataris, Bahrainis, others. In Europe, Jordan has also been playing a very delicate but so far effective game in Washington, not confronting the administration, but mobilizing its vast networks here, particularly in Congress, both among Republicans and Democrats. So Jordan is probably, we will see Jordan leading a diplomatic effort, severely reducing its diplomatic relations with Israel. But I do not see rupture, and I do not see Jordan heading towards a confrontation that will impact its other national security interests. So Jordan, if I were Israeli, I would worry very much about this. But again, Jordan has always been a very reasonable, moderate country and will not do anything that is rash.
So perhaps we can end with one last question, which probably isn't a short question, but looking at the question of succession within the Palestinian Authority. And you've recently co-authored a study on this called Palestinian Politics After Abbas, which I would encourage all our listeners to read. So could you give us perhaps a brief assessment of what succession looks like, what a post-Abbas world looks like, and what might happen to the PA the day after Abbas is gone?
First, thank you very much for plugging the article.
Of course.
As a spoiler, I guess I would say that the short answer to your question is we have absolutely no idea. And that's for a reason. Abbas had made it very intentionally, had ensured that there is no clarity when it comes to succession. And he's been leveraging that to his own interest. As a result of this, when he departs the scene, and when biology takes its toll, we will end up with a vacuum that has no clear successor. The inclination of the leaderships of the Palestinians, particularly the Fatah movement, will be to get together and to choose one among them, most likely the oldest, sickest, least ambitious of them all, to be a front to that. But this is the best case scenario. One can draw other plausible scenarios where these contenders cannot agree among themselves, and we end up with a protracted succession battle that could even turn violent. And that would be a recipe for tremendous instability. Now, any leader who will come after Abbas, even the most moderate of them, and some of them are indeed moderate and pragmatic, will start from a very weak point of view, weak starting point. Whether it is because of the bad economy, because of the image of the PA among its own public, because of annexation, and will be unable to make any major moves, will be vulnerable. But more worrying than this, and I will conclude with this point, the more worrying is, look, strong institutions are capable of absorbing major shocks. And we saw that with the PA itself after the death of Arafat. It was still a politically strong institution, and it could manage that transition. The PA today is extremely weak. Its legitimacy is in question among its own public. Internationally, it has lost its path and it has no clear direction. Economically, it's in bad shape. Governance-wise, it's known as corrupt. When you have weak institutions, major shocks can trigger a collapse. And this major shock could be annexation. Succession could itself be one of these major shocks. And I think what I would advise at this point is to look at ways of stabilizing the PA, of dealing with these sources of lack of legitimacy, so that when we get to a point of succession, you will have a strong institution that is capable to navigate such a disruptive event.
Well, Ray, thank you so much. This has been very insightful. I'm sure all our listeners will agree with me, and we're really grateful for your time.
Thank you, Ronie. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks.